Hello everyone, it's Mrs. Briskin. Today we're going to learn how to draw the face in a frontal view using the proportion lines that we learned about in our previous tutorial. So here we go. Get a blank sheet of paper and a pencil just to start. And the first thing that I'm going to ask you is, what shape is the skull? And a lot of us will say maybe we know it's rounded. And it's not a perfect circle, it's actually a bit more oval-like, but to be more specific, we like to refer to it as an egg shape. Why an egg shape? Because eggs are typically wider on one side, like this, I'll show you. So they're usually a little wider. And then there's a side to an egg that's a little bit more narrow. Okay, as opposed to just kind of a perfect oval where it's the same throughout. This is much more accurate to what our skulls look like. The top of our skull is wider and then it narrows as we come down the jawbone, which is also called the mandible bone, towards the chin, and it does get more narrow. So in order to create a nice egg shape, first we're going to create a circle. So go along with me. I want you to draw a circle. A nice size circle. Just like so. Okay, there we go. So we have a circle. This is really representing the upper portion of the cranium or the skull, kind of like where the brain sits. And obviously this is not the full face. But what I'd like you to add in right now is a central line. This is going to be our symmetry line because, as you know, when it comes to the frontal view of the face, both sides need to be symmetrical to one another. Okay, there we go. So now we want to add on a jaw or mandible bone. And when we attach that to our circle, I like to refer to it as a U shape. So it's almost like you're attaching the letter U to your circle. And by the way, when you do put this line of symmetry right down the middle of the circle, it's actually really helpful because it could help you to see if both halves of your circle are relatively equal and even. And if your sides are not, then you can always fix that right now, by the way. And that's what erasers are for. You can always erase any extra lines that you don't really need. So I'll just put that out there. Okay. So back to the U shape. I'm going to start on one side of my circle and watch what I'm doing with my pencil. I'm kind of working with the curve that already exists with my circle, and I'm going to work my way down towards my symmetry line. There we go. That's one half of the letter U. And this bottom area is representing the chin. I can continue straight up if I'd like, or if it's a little easier for you, you can always come from the other side of the circle, starting from the curvature of the circle itself, and then work your way down and connect it to the opposite side. So once again, this symmetry line is letting us see, like, are both halves pretty even? Are they equal? Okay, you can always go back there and tweak a bit. Okay, and you should have something that looks like this, like an egg shape. Okay, so now that we have our basic egg shape, let's talk about the law of halves that we learned in the previous video. So the law of halves is where you're going to place your eyes or eye sockets if it's a skull, your nose or nasal cavity if it's a skull, and your mouth or lips if it's a full-fleshed face, or teeth if it's a skull. And when we talked about this, the first indication of where to place those eyes is in between the top of the skull, the highest point, and the chin. So you want to find that nice halfway point because that is where the eyes live. That's where the features live. They are halfway down in between. So that means approximately here. This is where your eyes will go. And I'm going to label my lines, and these are just loose guidelines right now. We can always erase these lines later. Okay, just as we're more specific with the face. Okay, this I'm labeling eyes. So now we know that it's our eyes line. So according to the law of halves, from the eye line to the chin, about how far down does the nose go, or nasal cavity? It's really the base of the nose, like where the nostrils would be. And if you said halfway, you are correct. That is going to be the answer every time. So between the eye line and the chin, about halfway in between is where the nose lives. So let's draw a nice horizontal line representing that nose. Okay, and we will label that line nose. Okay, there we go. And finally, the last feature on the face that we need to account for would be the mouth or the lips. And those live halfway between the nose line and the chin. So right in between, halfway, we're going to indicate a horizontal line that represents the mouth. More specifically, it's where the two lips are separated and they meet. Or you could say where the two rows of teeth meet. So we have eyes, nose, and mouth. All right, we're missing two very important lines here. And that is the two vertical lines that divide each half of the skull in half. So let's place those in right now. Make two vertical lines. One on the left side, one on the right. Okay, there we go. So these two vertical lines, as I said, they divide each half of the skull in half. Why are these so important? Because they show us where our features actually live. So here's what I mean. Where it intersects, this vertical line intersects the horizontal line of the eyes, which is right here. It's like X marks the spot. It's almost like a little plus sign. And that actually represents the center of the eyeball. Okay, and then right over here on the opposite side, it also represents the center of the eyeball. And we will be drawing the eyeballs because we're going to be illustrating this face from the inside out. It's so important as artists, we're like scientists, that we understand the mechanics of these things. And so just to point out the other thing with this vertical line, if we continue further down the face, skip the nose, and we end up at the mouth. This actually represents the outer corners of the lips, where those end on a fleshed face, which we'll get to a little later on. But it's good to know that the outer corners of the lips will match up with the center of the eyes. Okay, so just to start, let's indicate the eyes by including the eyeballs. And of course, the eyeballs are spheres, they're circles, they're round, and let's indicate those shapes right now. So I'm going to also, I'm using this plus sign to my advantage because these work as central lines, guidelines, to tell me if my circles are even or not. Okay, so you want to try to match up your circles as best you can. Okay, I think I'm going to go a little bigger with the circles. And so the question is, how do you know how big to make these eyeball circles? Well, there's a really interesting proportion, and this is the truth. Did you know that if you were to literally take one of your eyeballs and stick it in between the two inner corners of your eyes, it would fit perfectly. the proportion would be exact. So it's almost like if you copied and pasted one of these eyeballs right in the middle, I'm just going to very lightly draw another circle, you would see that you would have another eyeball that is exactly the same size that fits in the space. So that's a really good way of knowing, oh, did I draw my eyeball circles too big? Did I make them too small? You'll know that they're too big if you can't fit one that's approximately the same size in between. And you'll know that they're too small if there's too much space. Like if you have gaps in between, then you'll know that. And the other question that's really interesting is how many eyeballs fit from the outer corners of the eye to the edge of the face? Is it 1? Is it 2? Is it something else entirely? Think about that for a minute. Okay, if you guessed 1 that is incorrect, but it was a good guess, the answer is actually half of an eyeball. So if we go like this, we have half of the eyeball. The edge of the face, really, like where like the hairline is, the edge that you're seeing, would end right about here. Okay? And then on the opposite side, it would be the exact same thing. So we have like a half circle. This side was drawn a little bit more accurately, so you can see that that half circle works. Now, you'll notice that my egg shape is not perfect. That's okay to start. Sometimes we're going to be erasing and shifting lines as we go. Like I could actually trim this to make it a little bit more accurate if I really want to right now, but I'm not overly concerned with that, like trimming this area that I just shaded. Okay, but it's a work in progress, but the proportions are key. It's really important that we're getting these proportions down. So these guidelines really help us to do that. All right, so taking a look back at our actual eyeballs, let's ignore all the other circles in between. We need to indicate what's in the middle of the eyeball, which is the iris. The iris is the colored portion of the eye, and it's like a perfect circle, right? It's the colored area that either dictates that we have blue eyes or green eyes or brown eyes or hazel or gray or anything in between. And it's actually a muscle. And what's really interesting is that that muscle controls that little black dot inside the eye. That's called the pupil. And the pupil is like a little hole, and it lets light into the eye, or it actually tries to block some light from coming into the eye, depending on the situation. So, for example, if you go into a crowded movie theater and it's dark in there and you are just in a light environment, your pupils are going to get much smaller because, actually much bigger because it needs to let more light in to see. And then if you walk outside after a few hours of being inside a dark movie theater, then suddenly your pupils are going to shrink down because it doesn't need so much light coming in. So that's kind of interesting. So you'll notice I'm starting to draw the colored portion of the eye, which is also known as the iris. The white portion of the eye is called the sclera. Okay, I'm still using my plus sign to help me center everything. Okay, and if you want to at this point, you can certainly erase that extra eyeball that we drew before. We don't need that circle anymore in between. So I'm just going to lightly erase that. I'm going to get rid of some extra lines that I really don't need at this point. You can do this along with me. Okay. Just going to clean up the edge here a little bit. Sometimes it's nice to just clean up your lines because it makes it a little more clear-cut and easy to see. Okay, so we'll change things around as we go. All right, so there we go. We have the iris. And then inside the iris is the pupil, that little black dot. So we're just going to indicate that right now. And you're probably like, oh my goodness, this face looks completely surprised. It looks like a robot. I always say that it looks like C-3PO from Star Wars when we start, but don't worry, that's completely normal when we're starting. Okay. Let's try this. Oh, there we go. I think I turned off my lamp so we could see it a little bit better. Okay, so now our eyes are missing something really important, and that is the lids. And when we look at our eyelids, we have both an upper lid and a lower lid, which protects the eye. They actually act like a curtain that drapes right over the eyeball. And so you'll notice that even with your eyes open, there's a little portion of the eye that's still exposed to the air, right? That's why when our eyes are open, we can still see the iris and the pupil, and we see a little bit of the whites of the eyes, right? So if you look in a mirror, what I'm referring to is the upper lash line, like where your eyelashes come out, and there's a lower lash line. So it doesn't matter, men, women, we have the same thing. And that's the area of the eye that's exposed and open when our eyes are open. And if I were to ask you what shape that exposed area of the eye looks like, that those two lash lines help to create, I would probably say, or I would love to hear you say that the answer is an almond shape. That's usually what people tell me. And it's true. Or you could call it like a football shape, and both would be correct. So we want to actually draw a line starting from the inner corner of the eye, draping over the iris, which is that colored ring, and ending on the opposite corner. So I'm actually using the horizontal line, which is halfway between the eyeball, to help me know where to stop my inner corner and where to stop my outer corner. And I'm going to do the same thing on the opposite side. So here's my inner corner, and I'm arcing it just along the iris to the outer corner of that eye. You want to try to make sure that your arcs are relatively even or equal. One trick that I like to use is actually a ruler, because it will tell you if one side is higher than the other, if you have to match them up a little better, but we're just doing this for practice. Okay, you'll also notice that this upper lash line, I draped it right over the edge of the iris, and there's a reason for that. So if you have the white of the eye showing above the lash line, or I'm saying just below the lash line, if you saw some white above the iris, the person would look very surprised. Usually when people are surprised, like they widen their eyes, their eyelids open up even more, and that's a surprise look. But when someone is just kind of relaxed and natural, and if you look in the mirror, you will see that this lower lash line does slightly drape over the iris. That's typical. Now let's look at the lower lash line. So starting from the inner corner of the eye, just like we did on the top, I'm going to draw my line. And this is where we're getting that almond shape from that I mentioned. So it's one lash line meeting the other lash line. So that looks like an almond shape. So here's our lower lash line. Right there. And that's a basic almond shape. So this would be our lower lid and now our upper lid. And so what's kind of interesting to see here when it comes to the lower lash line, some people, and this is just unique to individual people, some of their lower lash lines actually just touch the bottom of that ring, the bottom of the iris. Some people have it where it slightly overlaps it, and some people, like myself, have it where a little tiny bit of like a sliver of the white of the eye will actually be exposed, and that's normal. You know, that's just natural, and it depends on the unique individual. Okay, so you will find variation when you look in the mirror, depending on who you are and what your eyes do naturally. Okay, so another thing that we want to add to the eyes are the inner corner. It's like that little tear duct area. If you look very closely, that tear duct, that inner corner is like that little pinkish red area on the inner corner of the eye that connects to the white of the eye. See, like if this is the whole eye, it's connecting to it right in here. Some people compare it to like a little triangle shape. Some people say it looks like a little teardrop. Okay, that's really important to include, and that's a muscle that's sort of holding that eyeball in place and connecting it, and it's important to include. You'll also notice that if this is the inner corner, that little muscle shape, it actually has like a little parenthesis looking thing, like on the end, like where it attaches to the eyeball. So we're going to include that right now. You can look in the mirror and see, what does yours do? What does the shape of that little tear duct area look like in your eye? And that's going to add a lot more realism and make it look even more convincing. Okay, so we have that little inner tear duct. And something else to be aware of, for most people, their lower lash line ends before the upper lash line. So you can even angle this up a little bit, that lower lash line, or extend out the upper lash line to make it look a little bit more accurate. Okay, so now when it comes to eyelids, right now I have this very perfect kind of circle shape. That was because of the eyeball underneath it before. But the truth is, people's eyes are totally unique, and your eyelid shape will vary from person to person. But typically the start of the eyelid wraps right around that little tear duct shape, and then it's pretty close, like the crease of that eyelid, and then it will work its way up, probably a little bit more angled, and then it will eventually come down. But if you look carefully in the mirror, it will not touch that outer corner of the eye. There's going to be a little bit of gap of space in between. So we want to erase any lines that connect that. And I'm going to erase that eyeball, the rounded eyeball portion that was drawn before, to get a more realistic lid that looks like this. So I'm going to do the same thing on the opposite side. Okay, it's going to be close right next to that tear duct area. And then it's going to go up and across and down without touching that outer corner. I'm going to get rid of that little rounded eyeball shape from before. We don't need it. Okay, so we have something to this effect. And you can use your ruler and test it out back and forth and say, are your lines equal and even on both sides? How's it looking? And I do recommend having a mirror out in front of you when you're doing this, because whose face better to learn from than your own, right? Okay, and now when it comes to the lower lid,